Hello there, my name is Hannah Mesouani, and I am the Director of Mission and Equity Consulting here at the YWCA of McLean County. For our very first Think About It Thursday, or our bi-weekly mini training series, I wanted to talk about critical race theory, or CRT. It's a term that no doubt you have heard about a bajillion times on the news, and you might have caught yourself wondering, what is that? Sounds scary. I'm here to help you figure out what it actually means. So critical race theory is a graduate level legal framework. It was developed in 1970 by legal scholars. I'm in my third year of my doctoral program in education, and I'm just now starting to wrap my head around it. I say that to say that this is a complex, immersive concept that isn't necessarily able to be taught to little kiddos. Much like Antiracist Education, which was developed in the early 90s, it's an older concept, but we're hearing about it now a little bit more. It is one that is developed, again, by lawyers as a way or a framework to understand how race and racism interact with the law and therefore affect our lives. So from a systemic perspective to an individual perspective. And I can't emphasize it enough, it is not being taught in schools. For any parents watching this who have had to do Zoom school with their kiddos, you know just how hard it is to get your kids to sit still, understand Zooms, try not to show the pet cat on the camera, right? To teach critical race theory would be like trying to teach children the entire concept of algebra in the first grade. We might introduce the concept of what the number 0 is, but we're not about to have kids solve for X, right? But if you're wondering, but what is critical race theory though? Let's talk about some of the 5 principles or the 5 main tenets of it. The first tenet is that race, though a social construct, is real. Race and racism are interconnected at every level of our society. So I'm talking about current as well as historic. We can look to the redlining of pretty much any city in this nation and, other nations in the world, which forbade Black folks and people of color from living in predominantly white neighborhoods. More close to home in the US, we can look at the Black maternal death rate. So for Black women giving birth, 43 out of every 100,000 will die during the process, compared to only 17 out of every 100,000 for white women. We can also look to the prison population. The Black population of the US is only 13.4% of everyone that's here, but 34% of everyone who's in prison. This sort of racism is embedded in every part of our society, from the fact that we've only had one Black president to the fact that media representation typically prefers white folks, right? One of the other tenets of critical race theory is that we can challenge the master narrative. This highlights that neutrality is quite literally impossible. Here I have a headline of the Tulsa massacre, which you might not have heard about. This was devastating for the Black population, but something that isn't typically taught. If we're looking for examples more close to our current time and age, I invite you to look up the same headline on NPR, MSNBC, and Fox News. They can tell the same story in radically different ways, which is to highlight that there's always an element of opinion, bias, prejudice, or even preference. So we don't necessarily have the ability to be objective or neutral, much in the same way that certain government figureheads or the police inspire different reactions in us. So for some of us, they are symbols of trust and hope and safety, and for others, they're really scary. The next tenet that I'd like to talk about is that we must center experiential knowledge. And this is truly empowering for folks of all different backgrounds, right? I invite you to think of the story of Oliver Twist, right? We've all read it. We've all had to read Charles Dickens growing up, right? Before this book, the majority of stories that featured the street urchins or the pickpockets demonized them. It wasn't until this book that we were like, oh, hey, they're kids just trying to make it through, right? Same thing can be said for the character of Boo Radley. It's this notion that we allow students to tell their own truths and that their truths are valid. And I think that's something that is empowering for kids of all backgrounds, right? Especially when you don't see your own story represented in the books that you're reading. So think about your favorite stories when you were a kid. Mine was Phantom Tollbooth. There weren't really any Arabs in that, but you want to be able to see yourself in the stories that you are reading. You want to feel as though you belong. The fourth theory is that we are committed to social justice. Now, this is another one that I think we can all get on board with. It's the idea that all oppression is interrelated, but that we all have the ability to make the world better, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. Schools emphasize a lot of teamwork, right? So that when it comes to critical race theory, again, from a legal perspective, we're talking about being committed to social justice in all elements, not just in the law, but in the systems that cause folks to be caught up in the sort of spider web of legality, right? Again, we're probably not talking to our K through 12 kiddos about how to pass the bar. But if we're thinking about CRT from how we sort of live it, it's about trying to eradicate all forms of oppression, especially when it comes to race, but this can apply also to gender or sexuality. And the last tenet I want to talk about is that we must be interdisciplinary. So critical race theory draws from many different fields. Like I said, it started out as a legal framework, but it's now in academics, it's in psychology, it's in how we think about folks' mental health. When I think about how does this play out in the day-to-day, imagine having a business of only accountants. Who's going to do the selling? Who's going to do the building? Imagine having a hospital with only heart surgeons. What happens when, I got to go in for my foot? So it's this idea that we all have different skills to bring and that we are all going to be better for it when we work together. So if it's not so scary, what's the big deal with critical race theory? Between March and June of this year, Fox News mentioned critical race theory over 1,300 times. Again, a legal framework that has existed since the 70s. Now, the name itself can be kind of scary, so it makes sense that this is a concept that is being sensationalized and caused fear-mongering, especially around parents who want to make sure their kids are okay. The last 18 months have been hard, y'all. I understand that fear is real. However, we have to think about what critical race theory is, not what sensationalized media is telling us. The word critical sounds scary. If I'm criticizing something, I'm saying not good enough. But when we look at it from the academic perspective of what critical means, if you're a critical scholar or if you take a critical approach to something, you're not just poo-pooing it. You're looking for ways to make it better. So I see myself as being critical in my role. I want to be able to help folks more. I want to be able to help eliminate racism and empower women. Being critical is a good thing. It means you're not satisfied with the status quo. And then lastly, if my computer behaves, critical race theory has become yet another buzzword to create division. So I mentioned anti-racism, again, a concept that has existed from the 90s that we only heard about recently. These words, especially words that sound scary because it's got critical and race. And when we talk about race, so many of our shoulders just tense up, right? We need to drop our shoulders, and know that this is just another way to sort of divide public opinion and stop us from being able to come together and support our kids better. So lastly, critical race theory is not about making white children feel bad. It is not being taught in schools the same way that quantum mechanics isn't being taught in schools. Critical race theory from a legal perspective is about empowering folks of color to feel that they can call this country their own as much as anyone else can. And if we're thinking about it from the perspective of education, even if it were being taught in schools, which it's not, it's about allowing all children to be seen by the curriculum, to be supported, to be loved by their families, and to feel represented in the world that they are being educated to go into. So that's our first Think About It Thursday on critical race theory. I welcome any and all questions you have, as well as suggestions for future topics. If there's anything on your mind that you're like, I wonder what that is. So you can feel free to email me at this address here, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 Thursdays' time.